All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Alex Fullerton. We're at the Fullerton Wines tasting room in Portland. It's May 21st, 2021. Alex, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
First question, biggest question, is why wine?
Yeah, and so excellent question. I'll go back a little. So I was born in Denmark to a Swedish mom and half American, half Danish dad. And so they grew up, I always saw wine on the dinner table, and we would go on vacation to Burgundy and Champagne and Bordeaux, and a lot of pictures of me and my sisters as youngins are next to vines. Then we moved to Oregon when I was 9, and my parents fell in love with the Oregon wine industry and the wines. And when I graduated high school, my dad thought that it would be fun to kind of do what he did for me. So he took me on a trip to Loire Valley, Champagne, and Burgundy. And in Burgundy, no one warned me to keep 6 feet away from all the winemakers because they have a very contagious bug called the wine bug. So I caught the wine bug from Laurent Mouton in Givry, energetic young winemaker. Came back to the US and couldn't really afford that much wine, had a fake ID. And when I lost my fake ID, my friends and I started homebrewing beer. But I was always kind of more interested in wine. So ended up graduating from U of O with an econ degree, but got a job at Penner-Ash as I was finishing my last few classes for that, and fell in love with the wine industry, with the people, with the culture. And so kind of never looked back from there. Went and worked a harvest in New Zealand, and Penner-Ash took me back. So got to work under Lynn and Brian Irvine, who were amazing mentors. And then I got a job at Bergstrom. And again, Josh Bergstrom and Travis Bonilla, just amazing people that they're willing to tell you their deepest, darkest secrets and everything they've learned. And then in 2012, my parents, or I should say, my dad and I tricked my mom into starting a wine company. And here we are 9 years later, and my parents are not retired. We are full on in the wine industry, all three of us, and learning every day. That's kind of, there's a few more backstories, but that's kind of my intro into wine.
I'm curious, once you caught the wine bug in Burgundy, tell me about learning wine, about both kind of educationally, but also just like developing your palate. Tell me how that process worked for you.
Yeah, so initially the wine bug was just interest in wine and didn't have much to do with winemaking. And luckily for me, my dad's cellar, he was buying Burgundy and Bordeaux when it was still affordable. So he has had old, amazing bottles to share, and I've gotten to meet a bunch of amazing people throughout the world. Wine drinkers are unique in that they'll share their most hidden gems with really anyone, as long as they see passion. So it started with me kind of trying to develop my palate, and also with beer. We got into a lot of different beers, and just tasting food, all sorts of things to kind of sharpen the palate. But then I got really into the production side. And so through brewing beer, we became kind of beer nerds. My two best friends and I have kind of a mini professional brewery setup. Toys that you should not have when you're only brewing 15 gallons at a time, but fun toys to have nonetheless. So got really into that, and then wanted to do something in fermentation or something hands-on. So the job at Penner-Ash kind of was an aha moment that, it's wine that I'm a lot more interested in. I don't like following one recipe and perfecting one recipe. I kind of like when you're going with the flow and every vintage is different, and there's no recipe, but you're still kind of learning the process behind it, and learning what's the mechanism rather than the recipe. So
starting with Penner-Ash, I'm curious about the kind of your introduction to the winemaking process, and what surprised you about it, what excited you about it, and about learning from people like Brian and Lynn?
It's coming from beer. The thing that surprised me the most was how dirty it was. And Penner-Ash is a clean winery, so I mean you can make wine and not worry about sanitation and probably have it turn out okay if the wine gods are on your side. But Penner-Ash, they're very clean and make the wine to a very high standard in my opinion. But it was still so kind of dirty, and everything can come. Like in beer, you don't touch your hand on something, but in wine, you're always touching it, and you're working with it, and you're feeling it. And the first thing I remember seeing is Lynn walk up and just stick her hands into a ferment. I thought, this is fun. And I remember also falling into a ferment, a smaller one, so it was safe. I wasn't wearing the right shoes. And coming up like destroyed, thinking I had ruined the wine because I fell into it, and they were worried I was safe, not at all worried about the wine. And then I brought up my fear that I had ruined the wine, and they kind of laughed at me.
So obviously a large amount of physical labor involved. Tell me about like your first memories of working in New Zealand, working at Penner-Ash. What was your role, and what excited you about that part of the job?
Definitely initially grunt labor. And what was exciting about Penner-Ash is really, even though I knew nothing, they were showing me all aspects of it. And obviously not all aspects, but I do feel like I got to do, my first vintage, do a whole lot of different things. Enough to where I kind of lied when I got to New Zealand and said that I was very familiar with the presses, so they put me on running 2 presses for that harvest, and a lot of learning to do, but learning comes fast when you have a lot of time. A lot of hours equals a lot of learning.
What was the experience like in New Zealand versus Oregon? What were the biggest differences for you?
Size. So New Zealand, I worked at a winery where for example, when they asked what Penner-Ash's case production was, 20,000 cases at the time, my manager laughed and said, "We spill that in a year." And then also looked at the other Kiwis, and he was like, "You know a winery is small if they measure their size in cases." And in Oregon, you'll only ever hear wineries measured in cases. And our biggest wineries are quite small compared to the winery I worked at, Drylands, which is sister property to Kim Crawford. So it's a Sauvignon Blanc that's available at pretty much any grocery store in the US. And so got to make a lot of mistakes because it doesn't really matter that they move so much juice through. You get to try kind of everything and hone random things that you need as skills, like racking a tank. It's a little different when you're racking 200,000 liters on walkie-talkies than 2,000 liters, but once you get to the end and kind of how to run things and how to do it without introducing too much oxygen if you don't want oxygen, and simple things like sparging with inert gases. Got to learn a lot of how to do that, not just on a small scale, but on a large scale as well there. And got used to not sleeping as much in New Zealand as well, mainly by my own choice, because I worked night shift, and so I'd be out surfing in the mornings and be out sightseeing. I have since come to appreciate sleep a lot more. Something we don't always get during harvest, but it's an important part of learning as well. You don't learn how to make wine unless you're also sleeping at some point.
So at that point, you'd seen kind of the small boutique Oregon winery. You'd seen the giant New Zealand wine factory. Did you have an idea at that point? Excuse me for a second. Did you have an idea at that point what you wanted to do? Was at that point were you thinking wine as a career? And if you were you thinking of where you wanted to be and what you wanted to do?
Yes and no. So I was definitely thinking wine, at least for the time being. And I was also definitely thinking I'd keep working in wine, but I I kind of had no idea. And then just the longer I worked in the industry and the more people I met, specifically in the Oregon wine industry, but in the industry as a whole, it's a good selector for excellent people around the world. I figured I want to stay in this industry. This lifestyle is lovely. These people are lovely. But it took a few years, like about a year longer, until a lot of my dad and I talking and kind of thinking, should we try to start a winery? And in 2012, when we did start it, I will say I wasn't, I was ready to jump in, but it was kind of like, oh, sure, we can make some wine. And I was still working at Bergstrom when we started our own winery. And then within that first year is when it got really serious. And I figured, okay, we're making wine, we got to start selling it. We'll start making more. And it's snowballed into what it is.
Sure,
today.
Absolutely. So I have a lot of questions about getting started at Fullerton, but I want to stop and talk about Bergstrom first. Compare and contrast Bergstrom with your previous experiences. What did you learn there that you didn't already learn, and what was different about it than the other places you'd worked?
I got to do a lot more farming. So Bergstrom had me in the fields kind of all summer long, and I really fell in love with being in the vineyards initially at Bergstrom. And they have such a fun, cohesive team as well. I think they worked maybe longer hours than I had worked before, but it didn't really feel like it. It felt like a family. I actually had gotten also my best friend, he needed a job, so I'd gotten him a job at Penner-Ash the previous year, and then again, he wanted to work harvest, so he joined the Bergstrom team. And so great people / one of my very best friends working with me. And we all got sent out into the fields, and everyone got to do a little bit of everything. I also learned from Bergstrom that once you're in the thick of harvest, stop trying to have everyone do everything. It's okay to just focus and have one dedicated person be pressing white grapes, and once you get to pressing reds, have one person on the press and one person barreling down. And so learn how to operate a little more efficiently on a smaller scale from them.
So that then was your first real experience in the vineyards. I'm curious, tell me about what appealed to you about that and what the work was like.
So I love being outside. I always was outside as a kid, and remember my mom calling to the neighbor kids, like, it's time to come in for dinner. You guys are done. So being outside, getting sunshine, kind of you feel the dopamine and all those happiness chemicals. And it's just lovely. I mean, our summers are amazing. And it also brings it, if you're stuck in one aspect of something, it's not as motivating. If you're, for example, working on a factory line, if you're just doing the same thing over and over, versus if you get to see whole parts of the picture and see it more holistically. So I had been focusing on winemaking, but in my opinion, the more important part is what happens in the fields. Obviously, a lot of things happen in the winery, but the fields and the growing and everything that's happening right now is wildly important. Even what happened last year during the growing season is important for this year's crop. And so bringing it in and getting the whole picture, but also kind of getting to the roots of how to make good wine. Because Lynn brought me out in the vineyards for sampling, and I mean, she's a wealth of knowledge. So I knew she was very focused on the vineyards. And I knew all good winemakers were focused on the vineyards, but getting the chance to be out in the vineyards we were working with and actually doing some of the work, like some leaf pulling, some fruit dropping, and learning more about the process in the vineyard was that lit a light, and we had actually planted a few Chardonnay vines already ourselves, and so we had planted 22 vines, and after that it grew to 468 vines in my parents' backyard, and another 260 some up in my parents' neighbor's house. So it got us itching to grow grapes, and got us itching to learn more about growing grapes, which, as stated, is the most important part of the puzzle.
So as the idea for starting Fullerton Wines is coming about, what was the vision at the beginning? What was the goal that you had, and how did you sort of see it playing out? What were the first steps you took?
So it's been a work in progress, but one thing we've always wanted to do is kind of explore the Willamette Valley through the diversity of the AVAs, and with that, kind of working with each individual vineyard to express the uniqueness of each vineyard and each vintage. And so we've always kind of tried to spread out throughout the valley where we source our fruit from. We've had a home base. We started making wine in Portland, and so had kind of a home base close to Penner-Ash and Bergstrom, sourcing fruit from Chehalem Mountains, Ribbon Ridge, and Yamhill Carlton. But also we have a soft spot for the Dundee Hills and for the Eola Amity Hills specifically for me. So we've wanted to diversify and source from all of the AVAs, and those are expanding. So that's something we're, in 2021, we'll be making wine from every single sub-AVA. So we'll finally have achieved that part of the goal. And we've also always been very experimental. So I've been fortunate enough to have mentors that are some of my favorite winemakers in the valley. Also at the Southeast Wine Collective, we've had excellent people to ask, like Tom Monroe, Ann Hubach, and for a completely fresh take from I think everyone else, Vincent Frischke is. I've asked that man. I have picked his brain so many times, and it's just great to have a wealth of knowledge you can pull from. So yeah, we've always explored stylistically. We've kind of looked backwards at old school techniques that I think the Pinot Noir producers of America, like especially the old school California Pinot makers, really did bring back a lot of old school techniques that were falling out of favor. And then we've also always had an eye on the future, so new technology, new toys. Since our first vintage, actually since before our first vintage, since our 2011 garage wine, we've used these rotator barrels. So they're big 500-liter puncheons with a latch up top that you can fill with grapes, and then they sit on a stand with casters. So instead of punch downs or pump overs, you spin the barrel. And just a unique style of fermentation, and you can actually do true carbonic maceration in them and pressurize whole clusters. So we love to play. And if it works, we stick with it. If it doesn't work, we don't stick with it. So playing, but also learning from our mistakes. And learning the mechanism behind things. Because again, with wine, it's not a recipe. Everything, all the factors are always going to be different. And so a recipe won't help you, but knowing mechanism will help you a lot.
So take me through the process of getting started then, of figuring out what the first steps were to start a brand and to secure grapes and to find a place to make wine and all design a label, all the things you had to do. And did you feel you were ready for all those steps, or what were the biggest kind of challenges for you in the beginning?
Truth is I was not ready. We were not ready. But you will also probably never be ready, at least on the time frame that we're working with. I think maybe I'd feel ready if I had 15 vintages under my belt, which now I'm close to that number, and I do now feel very ready. But initially there was, well, I have to thank all of the names I've said before already, and some more names for really being awesome. And I mean, I've called people at midnight with questions, kind of freaking out during harvest, and they're like, sit down, Alex, breathe. It's not rocket science, it's rosé. And I've had the opportunity to learn faster than I think I ever would have if we didn't start the company, but no, I did not feel like I was ready initially. But luckily, thanks to all the amazing people, that didn't actually matter quite so much.
So in terms of the rest of it, how did you find grapes, and how did you find a place to make wine, and what was the idea for sort of quantity and growth of how much wine you were going to make?
So finding grapes, that's the most important part. Some vintages it's been easier than others. So we kind of lucked out. 2012, we started working with just Fircrest Vineyard in Yamhill, Carlton. So old vines. Some of the vines are older than I am, and just really nice vineyard that maintains perfect acid. Kind of a lot of what we like in wine, Fircrest has naturally. So we got to make high acid, kind of crunchy Pinot for our first vintage. And then through connections and through knowing people is where we started finding newer vineyards. So we were introduced through the Crofts from Josh Bergstrom. And then I fell in love with Mumtazi Mesera when I tasted, Tamina poured me something, and I have it, I think it was 2008 James Sheed. I have it written down, but it just blew my socks off. And I thought maybe we should go find some grapes from that vineyard. And so Mumtazi has been one of our favorite single vineyards that we've worked with, that are favorite amongst our customers and amongst us. And from there we've kind of branched out and been very kind of picky and slow. We do have a second label. So we've had to find a second label called Three Otters. So we have had to go out and find some more vigorous sites capable of producing a little more per acre for that site. So that's been great for exploring all the lesser known areas of the Willamette Valley. And there are some really, really lovely pockets for growing grapes in the southern bit of the valley that there are places that are known now, but I think some places that are going to be discovered. And particularly, we make the wine in Corvallis. And I will say some of the grapes grown in Philomath area are pretty exciting to me, especially since there's some volcanic soils down there and a lot of coastal wind that comes in from down there as well. So a little mimicking maybe Mumtazi or Eola Amity Hills with windy sites and volcanic soil.
You mentioned that the first batch or the first vintage you made was the kind of wine you want to make. How did you know at that point this is the kind of wine we want to make? This is what our wines are going to be like? So
we kind of came at it thinking that we were going to start with a little bit bombastic of a style, a little bit bigger, and then we were going to refine the style from there. Kind of along the lines, I think I got this idea in my head, because if you're going to start home brewing, IPAs are a great way to start because there's a lot of antimicrobial properties in hops and just kind of higher alcohol, so it's more stable. So I kind of came at it thinking if we make a slightly bigger Pinot, maybe there will be less chance of flaws, and then we will refine it from there. So the style of our 2012s is definitely pretty big compared to what our house style has become. But I've also learned that I'm totally okay with big, as long as there's acid to balance it out. The thing we don't like is flabby wines. and luckily we're making wine in Oregon, so it's a little easier not to make flabby wines. And then again, big, I don't have, like, I like big wines, but there are, Pinot Noir maybe shouldn't be a big wine. Maybe if you want a big wine, maybe there are other varieties than Pinot Noir for you. So we're definitely chiseling down. I don't think we don't try to use masculine or feminine generally, because what does that mean? But I think we've found our house style, and it's not on the super, super light end, and it's definitely not on the super heavy end. It falls somewhere in between.
You mentioned starting with the Southeast Wine Collective. Tell me about making wine there, about finding them and working at that space.
Yeah, so it was the perfect place for us to end up. It was one little winery, not terribly much bigger than like two of our tasting rooms put together. Where 10 different winemakers were making wine under one roof. So chaos is a word that you could describe, but a very good chaos, a positive chaos. Like you feel good feelings when you go in there and see everyone busy and running around. And if you want 20 different answers, ask 10 different winemakers the same question. So in terms of learning a lot of different thoughts and a lot of dogmatic feelings from people and a lot of kind of laissez-faire feelings and about what different winemakers think about all aspects of wine, I don't think we could have chosen a better place to just get the whole 360-degree window of Oregon wine, from as natural as they come, of like I will not add anything, it will be fine, to like I'm on top of this and like nothing is going to be fermenting these grapes other than what I want fermenting these grapes. So we got to see kind of the whole process of all those different styles for a few years too, because it's one thing is harvest, and harvest is very important, but good winemakers spend a lot of time. I mean, you have to top off the wine, you have to take care of the wine throughout the year. And that's where we got to learn all people's different understanding of what it means to take care of the wine over the year and get it ready for bottle.
You mentioned that you're now making wine in Corvallis. Tell me about the transition to that, finding a space there, and what that added to your abilities, moving from Southeast Wine Collective to your new space.
Yeah, so Southeast Wine Collective, we kind of outgrew. In 2013 was a huge crop, and we had one particular vineyard that didn't do their crop estimation right, so we kind of filled up a whole section of that winery. And so in 2014, a few people moved in or moved out, and there was a little more room. But by 2015, it was clear that we probably needed to find another place. So we actually went down to Eugene Wine Cellars for a year, and that was also, completely different production style, and again, multiple winemakers in one roof, so a lot of people to ask questions and a lot of relationships that are valuable to this day. Then we moved up to Corvallis, and we did that to kind of get more bells and whistles. There was room available. We shared the winery we're in for a year with Soder. So one of the greatest wineries in Oregon as well, I will say, to my taste. And Soder, a lot of their technique, we learned a lot of techniques from them. So they do like to do extended maceration. This is kind of down the rabbit hole, but something we really like doing that we directly learned from Soder. So moved into Belle Valley. That was the old winery. And we now share that with a couple other winemakers. And we have plenty of room. There's a lot of bells and whistles that weren't in the Southeast Wine Collective or Eugene Wine Cellars. And pretty simple things like access to chilling a tank and access to heaters. So we now can do everything we want to. If there's a wine that's not fermenting and we want it to ferment, we don't have to wait on the ability to use a heater because the same heater is also the chiller and someone's chilling. We can now just heat the tank, get fermentation going. Or opposite, we're not like, oh, this white wine is getting up into like 68 degrees Fahrenheit. I wish I could cool it. Now it's like, nope, this is temperature controlled at 60 or temperature controlled at whatever we want. So a lot more control, which is pretty important.
You mentioned white wines, so tell me about, in addition to Pinot Noir, what else are you working with and how has that changed over the years?
So Chardonnay since 2013. So we started with just Pinot, and then we thought we were just going to do Pinot and Chardonnay. And at least we figured we're going to learn how to make Pinot and Chardonnay the way we want to make it before we branch out. And then in 2017, we got a chance to work with the Old Vine Pinot Gris down at Lavelle Vineyard, which used to be called Forgeron Vineyard. And so 1969 Pinot Gris, it's hard to say no. So I convinced my dad we should make rosé out of the Pinot Gris. So we were going to soak on the skins, and the Pinot Gris, on the day of harvest, we were down there tasting the old vines, and they tasted so good that I was like, Dad, let's make a little bit of white Pinot Gris. And he said, for sure, without a doubt, let's try this. And it was a huge success. So now we make Pinot Gris. In 17 as well, and actually in 15, we made a little Syrah. But 17, we made some Southern Oregon Syrah. And club members fell in love with the Syrah by the time it was released. So now there's a gap. So we had to start making Syrah again. And we've been moving kind of into the gorge for some stuff. So we're going to make some Sauv Blanc and actually Cab Sauv from the gorge this year. But in the interest of kind of spreading across Oregon, we went all the way out to Walla Walla and found some Rocks District Syrah from the Oregon side. So we're trying to explore all of Oregon, and we also make some Viognier from the Willamette Valley. But we do more kind of fun, low intervention. We do some orange wine and some Pet Nat with that, and zero addition wines, which is another thing we've always been interested in, is zero or low additions. I see benefits to sulfur, but I see major benefits to trying to make wine without sulfur as well. And always, the less sulfur you can use, the better. I don't think you'll find any winemaker that disagrees with that. If I don't know, if a wine goes bad and you have to add too much sulfur, it'll mute the wine permanently. So limiting inputs has always been important to us, both in the vineyard and in the winery.
Sure. You mentioned that, looking back, or even maybe at the time, you knew you weren't quite ready for what the challenges that you were starting. But I'm curious, tell me about your growth as a winemaker and about adding all these different varieties, all these different kind of styles, all these different vineyards. Tell me about the comfort level, the confidence for yourself. At what point did you feel confident trying new things, bringing in new vineyards, trying new styles? Tell me about that kind of the growth for you personally.
I think the comfort has kind of slowly showed up, and kind of seeing taking yourself out of it, because obviously the winemaker is a big part of it, but if you find good grapes, then it's more about not messing up the grapes than it is about you having the skills to do something. And experience is key. So I don't feel like I was ready because I didn't have the experience. And that doesn't mean that we didn't make wines that we're proud of, because we're very proud of the wines we made. I just think some of that can be attributed to the people I asked. So the mentors and the many, many amazing winemakers in the Willamette Valley. Some can be attributed to Oregon being an amazing place to grow grapes. And then some can be attributed to luck. And then some to hard work. Because wine on some level can make itself, but on another level doesn't make itself. Like grapes hanging in a vineyard don't turn into wine. But grapes destemmed in a vat will turn into wine no matter what you do. But the quality of that wine is kind of, and the characteristics of that wine. So how much you do and when you do it is important, and really finding the confidence of knowing when to pull back and when to be like, no, something's going wrong, let's intervene here. And that's what I think has been building, and is probably still building. Because I do feel confident now and comfortable, but probably with another 10 years in the book, I'll feel even more confident and comfortable.
So one of the things you mentioned early on was, as you were getting started, that's selling, obviously a challenge, something maybe you don't think about initially as you're starting a brand. Tell me about selling wine and about finding a club, finding fans, finding members, and growing your brand through that. What was the most important thing about selling wine in the early days? Who were you trying to get it to, and how has that changed over the years?
Yeah, so selling is the hardest part. It's not terribly hard to end up with good wine through all of the things you do. But then selling that good wine, if it's not good, then good luck selling it. But if it is good, then still it's going to be a lot of work selling it. And so we went initially, we started doing tastings at my parents' house in Beaverton, which was lovely because people come in and they're like, am I at the right place? Like, this is awkward. And no, come on in. And you see them like, whoa, this is cool. I'm being welcomed into someone's house. The 468 Chardonnay vines are right here. And so we ended up with a pretty strong club fairly early on, and still have a lot of people that are part of our club now, whatever, 7 years after we started, or 8 years after. And really having the ability to have a tasting room was a privilege. Having my parents being open to having strangers in their house, having Washington County be okay with having strangers in my parents' house. All those things we lucked out. Without that, it would have been way harder. So all the small people that are selling through distribution and self-distributing everything, that is a grind. And those people are amazing and hard workers. And I mean, we've been there too, but I don't think we were ever as successful at that part as some other of my good friends. And I mean, Corey Schuster comes to mind. Fantastic personality, lovely person. And I mean, you meet him, you want to buy his wine, but it's a grind. He's out there meeting and hand selling all of his wines. And so we got into distribution and realized we kind of needed a more affordable Pinot Noir. The market wanted that. And so to be able to get into distribution, we started the Three Otters label. And that's kind of been the only thing that distribution can move on its own without us coming out to help. Which makes sense. I mean, a $20 on the shelf Willamette Pinot is going to move a little bit. But even with a distributor, if you're not out there in the market actively selling and visiting people, you do disappear. So staying on top of it and following up, two things I naturally am not very good at, but those have been very important. And luckily for us, my dad is good at making sure I follow up and following up. And our employee number one, who's done a lot of sales for us, also excellent and good at following up. And so all three of us have had success, I will say, with distribution, but we've had way more success with direct to consumer. And going back to my parents' house in the tasting room, we outgrew that spot. So Washington County was okay with us having up to 7 people there at a time. And I do remember one time where it was shoulder to shoulder. There were more than 7 people there. So we needed to move. So we found this spot that we'd actually looked at a few times. And there was construction out on the streets, and it really wasn't a good spot. And then when we finally kind of needed it, the construction had stopped. Hundreds of people had moved into the buildings around, maybe thousands. So it turns out to have been a really good spot for us to land, and really nice bringing us back into Portland. Even though we made wine in Corvallis, I was living in Portland and kind of sleeping in the winery. So it's been good to have the home base here. I now spend enough time in the winery that I live in Corvallis. But yeah, so direct to consumer is what really has, we've, especially post-COVID, we kind of, when all the restaurants closed, we pivoted and have focused almost all of our efforts on direct to consumer.
I'm going to come back and ask you about 2020 here in a minute, but you raised an interesting question there for me, which was the idea that you're in Portland, you're in an urban winery setting. Tell me about how this changes your sort of clientele and how you fit into the neighborhood and what you do differently here than maybe a tasting room in the valley would do.
Yeah, and so huge difference actually coming from Beaverton to here. Just the type of customers and how we've kind of set up the tasting room. And it's changed a lot how we do things over the years, but once we moved into Portland, it became more of a bar and less of a tasting room. And one thing, if another winery is planning on opening in Portland, you kind of have to count on less total kind of wine purchases. People in wine country are more likely to leave with full cases. But you get more people during the off season. Sometimes when it's really nice, people leave the city for the valley and we get slow here. But we've pivoted and kind of turned into more of a restaurant. And that really happened in the beginning of 21. Or end of 20, we hired my next door neighbor, the person who has been my roommate the longest out of anyone except for my parents and siblings. So one of my best friends. We've lived together multiple times, and he's been a chef for a long time. So we've been collaborating. I've been popping bottles, and he's been cooking for pretty much our whole life. We've been cooking together. He got for a while he was not allowed to cook in my mom's kitchen after we decided to make chocolate chip pancakes one day. And I can understand why. I think I should have also been punished. No kitchen should look like this and be left. But so we always cook together, and he's now our head chef and making a fantastic menu to pair with the wines. And so that's been the latest pivot, is more towards full-on wine and food, sit down, and it has brought in a lot more people, especially because so we've got, I don't know if I should, we haven't announced it yet, but he hired another rock star. So it's 2 rock stars chefs in there right now. And the food speaks for itself.
What made that something you wanted to do, the food offerings? Was it something you sensed a need for, or was it just because the opportunity was there?
Yeah, maybe both. I will say my mom and I were a little more skeptical. And my dad is just high-powered, always willing to try something, and then if it doesn't work out. So my dad was the driving force behind this, and I just, when it started happening, I backed him up. Said, sure, let's try it. I believe in Jamie, I believe in you, I think you guys can make this happen. So I have not been a big part of establishing the tasting room as a dining destination, but they're killing it, so they don't need my help.
Well, let's talk about 2020 since we've already kind of brought it up. Obviously, a couple big things happened in 2020. So let's start with the pandemic. Kind of immediate reaction for you and kind of how it affected your work life. I'm curious, what was sort of the first things you had to deal with, and what were the changes you had to make throughout the year?
So, initially uncertainty, which is the biggest. I mean, I don't think anyone's ever dealt with uncertainty like the beginning of 2020. And then we kind of started planning. So we have contracts for most of our fruit, but we started talking and changing. So we planned on making less wine, since initially sales just kind of plummeted. So planned on making less wine and shifted to a lot more direct to consumer. We ran a case sale pretty early on, which I think actually kept cash flow coming in, because before anyone else kind of had a COVID sale, we did have a case sale that I think we called it a social distancing sale. And then with the success of that, saw that we're going to have to drive a lot of direct-to-consumer stuff. We're going to have to do a lot of virtual tastings, and we're going to plan on making less wine. And so all ended up being pretty good decisions in the long run. And then as harvest started getting close, I feel more confident now than ever, but it was still, with people losing their sense of smell from COVID, and I mean, as the least bad thing that could happen, we were very shut off and isolated. So we had rules of no one can come in the winery. We had kind of, with the other people that make wine in the facility, we had agreements of please don't go out and hang out with random people, and please be careful. And we kind of formed a bubble. So it was my assistant, and we had another guy working for us in the winery as well. He was kind of a swing employee, but he became winery only so that we could be our little crew. And we were huddled and ready for anything. And we got more than we thought we were going to get. We'll just put it that way. And learned a lot more this harvest about a lot of things than we thought we would.
Maybe than you hoped to.
Yeah.
Tell me about that. Tell me about dealing with this harvest. What were the biggest decisions you had to make, and the biggest things you had to learn, and how did you kind of get through dealing with all of the smoke, all of the fires around harvest?
Yeah. So we picked all our fruit. The fires meant that some sites you could not make red wine. And then there's a huge, so we made some Pinot Noir. We picked some fruit before the fires. So we have some really, really tasty 2020 Pinot Noir. And then we have some really good 2020 white Pinot Noirs. And we are selling the Rosé and Pinot Gris. Pinot Gris, we couldn't press everything out of it. We kept everything but fermented it separately. And then some stuff just didn't make the final blend.
Sure.
And we fermented things differently as well. So it was a low yield already in the vineyards. And then we had low press yields because you couldn't press as much out of the skins. So for Pinot Gris, we actually had some really lovely larger Chardonnay puncheons that with low mileage, so some oak flavor left. Mm-hmm. And we fermented the Pinot Gris in those, and that's something we for sure will try to do in the future because of how much we love what that did to the wine. And overall, you always learn every vintage, or at least that's the goal. And I mean, that is, no matter what, you learn every day. But we learned a lot more in 2020 than I think we've learned in any other vintage. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And hindsight's 2020, so I know a million things I would do if we get an event like that again. Mm-hmm. We are prepared.
More prepared at least.
Yeah.
In terms of from your own sort of personal sort of the values or tastes, what were the limits you were tasting for when dealing with a smoke event like that that's going to be varied over various locations and various types of fruit? What was the limit for you? How did you kind of determine that?
Great question. When we did the bucket ferments initially, so the very first ones we did, we were pretty early, and there was still a lot of smoke in the valley, and I brought out with Andrew Bandy Smith, the winemaker from Antiquum that we share a facility with, who is just a wealth of knowledge. We were thinking, can you even taste smoke influence if it's in the air? Mm-hmm. Like it was in the winery, it was in the air, you couldn't get away from it. Mm-hmm. So we pulled out bottles that we knew, other bottles from previous vintages that we knew had smoke impact, that we both had, and we could not taste it. We could tell it was there because of a similar type of flavor you get with Brettanomyces, but we could not taste any smoke because it was in the air. So we were kind of like, okay, good to know. We will wait to do any sort of evaluation at all. And then the bucket ferments, we started fermenting them. You ferment them in really warm conditions. So we had the heater on in the bathroom, and the warmer the better. You want the enzymes to free up as much of the smoke compounds as you can. But the bucket ferments, it's hard to get all of it out, and it's hard to get them to be dry. Mm-hmm. So any amount of sugar there is going to stop your enzymes in your mouth from releasing the smoke compounds from their bound form. Because they're glycosides, it makes sense, it's a sugar molecule, so if there's free sugar present, it's going to inhibit the enzymes that are there in order to create free sugars. Mm-hmm. And so it's a thing people know about. It's actually one way of mitigating smoke influences by leaving a little bit more residual sugar in the wine, and that does help. But that means you can't taste it that well in the bucket ferments. And even if you get a bucket ferment dry, that took you however many days, and then it's still going to increase for about 9 months. And I don't know when you get close to equilibrium, but based on what we know now, 9 months is a good number. Then you're kind of at equilibrium, but you're probably there at like 6 months. But if you're evaluating the wine at 4 months, it's gonna get smokier. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Or the smoke influence will grow with time. So the bucket ferments are a challenge. And using just those, you could have a bucket ferment that's like, oh, mild smoke influence, we can make red wine, but the red wine's gonna have higher influence. If you have a bucket ferment with like zero noticeable smoke influence, yes, the wine will probably be good, but someone will probably be able to taste smoke in it. Mm-hmm. It's very variable. And then we have also found that from day to day, you are more or less susceptible. So it's pretty tricky. And there's a lot of compounds like that where you can zero your palate in, or your palate is zeroed in at different levels. So from day to day, susceptibility can be different. And then I also learned that I'm on the medium susceptibility. There are people on very high susceptibility to smoke influence where they pick it up just very fast. And luckily for me, my assistant and Andrew Bandy Smith are very susceptible to it. So we have those palates to test.
Sure. So with all that in mind, all that you learned when it comes to making red wine in 2020, obviously you mentioned you've done some picking before the smoke, you have other grapes from other parts of the state. What's the outlook for you, and what do you think the outlook is for Oregon in terms of 2020 red wine production?
As a state, I think the Willamette Valley was potentially a little more impacted than some other areas. I've tasted some stuff from down south where I feel like I can get a little, but nothing distracting. And then it was highly variable based on where you were. So it's like close to the Van Duzer corridor wasn't as bad. I think up against the Coast Range was less influenced. And so the diversity is pretty interesting in impact. And then high elevation seemed also to be more impacted than lower elevation, which is something that they've found in California. And then there are certain grapes that are more susceptible. Petit Verdot is more susceptible, but this year we found that Chardonnay in the same vineyard seems to be less impacted than other varietals or varieties. So that was pretty interesting.
So tell me about, we're going to kind of zoom out in the industry a little bit here. I'm curious, from when you first came into the Oregon wine industry, what are the biggest changes you've seen in Oregon wine? What's different about it now versus when you started? And as you look ahead, what's coming next?
So definitely a lot of investment from outside, from California, from Burgundy, and a lot of newcomers. I mean, we kind of joined. I had gotten a taste of the wine industry, but then in 2012, when we started the company, there was an influx of a lot of us. So we joined at a time when the amount of wineries boomed. And it was a pretty interesting time because a lot of new small wineries making a lot of non-traditional wines, non-Pinot Noir wines. And yeah, kind of the style of the Willamette Valley seems to have just broadened even more. And I think it was broad to begin with, but it definitely has broadened. And then our vintages are getting warmer. So what we can do, we still have cool vintages, but we have a lot more warm vintages now, and we have vintages that are hotter than ever. So stylistically, I think we're just opening up. And grape-wise, what people are growing, I think obviously you should keep growing Pinot Noir. I like it. I think we do a good job of growing it here. I think Chardonnay as well. If you would have asked me 10 years ago, I might have talked crap about Pinot Gris. I will take those words back. They're even 6 tons to the acre Pinot Gris can make delicious drinkable wine, and there's a time and place for that. And yeah, all the like Trousseau, Gamay is exploding, and I think we have a lot. I think people should plant Sauv Blanc. Actually, I've just talked to a grower about planting us half an acre of Sauv Blanc, and I think Willamette Valley Sauvignon Blanc is exciting. Maybe even some of the other Loire varietals. Cabernet Franc, there are clones that can grow really well in the Willamette Valley. And like Scott Frank from Bow and Arrow, he makes 50% Cab Sauv, 50 Cab Franc, and it's delicious. I love that wine. Air guitar. I drink a bottle of that at least once a year. I try the new vintage just to see, and I think that is an inspiration, that wine. And not that we're going to start making Willamette Valley Cab Sauv or Cab Franc, but just it is inspiring that he can make that approachable of a wine with no intervention from old vine Cab Sauv, grown outside of Corvallis actually, and then a cool site Johann Cab Franc. So it kind of flips a lot of what I thought I understood upside down.
So that in mind, what will the industry look like in the coming years? What changes do you foresee, and maybe what are you looking forward to, or are you afraid of or fearful of?
So fearful of our globe. I mean, warmer weathers and wildfires and fierce storms and all the things that are coming. But I do think the Willamette Valley is we're located well, and we're gonna have a climate for Pinot Noir for the foreseeable future. But we're also gonna have a climate for like Willamette Valley Syrah. Lovely stuff, and I think that's just gonna get better and better. But I just hope that we keep our cool climate at a level that can still be called a cool climate. And I don't know, I'm forever optimistic, but if you're not also a little pessimistic, then you gotta have both.
Sure. What about from a growth side? Obviously, you mentioned you were part of a massive growth in the Oregon wine industry in the past couple of decades, especially the last decade. What do you see for the size of the state's industry as you look ahead?
I mean, I think we're still going to stay relatively small. I think the investments that have come in are still making wine at a kind of hand level. And like Bollinger coming in now and buying Ponzi, I think is congratulations, guys, nice work. But it's still going to be Ponzi. Louisa's still going to be there making beautiful wines. And I still, everyone that's come into the Oregon wine industry and done it well has done it with collaboration and open arms. And I think if anyone tries to come in any other way, it's not going to work for them. It's such a tight-knit community and industry that I think it's so tight-knit, I don't see that changing. I think it's knit so tightly that no one can undo the yarn. And if they want to be part of it, they're just going to have to stitch themselves in.
That's a good metaphor. That's solid. I like that. What about for yourself and for Fullerton? What are you seeing for the future? What are your kind of hopes and goals, and for yourself, and as well as the growth of the business?
So for the future, like I said, we're planning on. Our goal is to explore the whole Willamette Valley through kind of the lens of the different AVAs, but also start exploring more of Oregon. But kind of medium term. We do want to have an estate vineyard and a facility of our own. And specifically, there's a lot you can learn about the facility and making it work the way we want it. And there's a lot of people that have some crazy good ideas that make your life easier. But I don't know, finding the right spot, finding somewhere where we want to grow grapes. Maybe it's an established vineyard, maybe not, but somewhere to call home and somewhere to really get to play around full on in the vineyards. And we work with growers that are more than happy to do whatever we want in the fields. But somewhere of our own that's a little bigger is definitely on the map. And then somewhere, I think we'll always keep our tasting room in Portland. We have a great following, great club members, but another place to come and taste. You can right now come join me and James in Corvallis and taste in our 55-degree barrel room, get the true, authentic experience. But having somewhere where we can do that, that eventually is our own, where we can. We have a little garden that we farm next to the vineyard for food in the kitchen here, but growing that and really having, like, not just farm to table, but eventually having, like, everything you're eating came from this property, grown with the world and the environment in mind. And then horticulture also, or sorry, permaculture also interests me. So having not just vineyard and animal husbandry, like Antiquum Farm, they have this grazing-based viticulture that is just, quite frankly, awesome. And working sheep into the vines, he trains them by feeding them a fresh grape shoot every year and an Volcent. So they get sick from eating the grape shoots, so they think, don't eat that. And as long as there's things on the ground to forage, they're not going to go back up to the grapes. And that is, I mean, not having to drive a diesel tractor down the road, if it's just being mowed for you, that's a big win. And now there are electric tractors coming out too, so that's something I've been keeping a very close eye on. The technology is alive and well in China, but there's been a lot of work blocking the Chinese companies from entering the US, and there's now a US company, the Monarch tractor. So I think that's going to change farming quite a bit once it's carbon neutral running a tractor and tilling. That'll change my thoughts on mowing and tilling quite a bit. And right now we're in our little ivy slope vineyard. We're on year 3 of no mow, no till. So it's just really high cover crop that we fold down and kind of step down. And that could work theoretically in a vineyard if you had a big heavy roller. I know some people do that. But that's something that's always interested me, and having a site where we can do like full-on experiments of 1 acre like this, one like this, one like this, and see what the vines do and see what's better it will be fun, rather than just, no, we have this plot, we're going to stop mowing it and see if it even works, which it does work. It's just the grasses don't always want to stay down. From my body weight, but maybe a little heavier. And an idea behind this is there's big farms in like the Midwest that do this, that have these rollers where you grow enough of a cover crop and then the roller kind of breaks the stalk, and then you have a layer of mulch to trap water and no more leaves growing that transpire water out of the ground.
Interesting. You have a lot of ideas. Do you have a place in mind where you'd like this vineyard to be, part of the state?
We are open. So that's the fun thing is, I love the Willamette Valley. I love the Yosemite Hills, but I also love the closer side of Hood River. Excellent Pinot Noir. So if we end up in Hood River, we'll still always make Willamette Valley wine, but we're going to stay in Oregon. Oregon is home. Oregon's my favorite place on earth, so that's non-negotiable. And then closer, for me, preferably Western Oregon. I like it a little cooler and wetter.
All right, last question for you. We're gonna get a little philosophical for you. Tell me in your mind what the role of wine in society is.
Oh, that's a great question. Wine in society is a unifier. It brings people together from all walks of life, and Yeah, it almost, we like to say wine speaks a universal language. So you don't even have to be able to understand the other person that's sitting next to you, but sharing a glass of wine, there's a deeper connection and understanding there. And it's a bridge between many different cultures, and it keeps expanding. I mean, if wine wasn't so popular, then all the cultures that grow wine today wouldn't have started growing wine. They would have done something else. There's something lovely and romantic, specifically about sharing the same bottle of wine. That's why I love magnums and 3 liters, because if you're with a big group of people and you're drinking from the same bottle, there's something romantic and lovely about that.
Love that. So all the questions that I have for you, is there anything I didn't ask that I should have, anything we didn't cover here today that we should have covered?
No, I think the questions were amazing.
Well, thank you. I'm very flattered. Appreciate your time today. Appreciate your hospitality, showing off this great space and sharing some great answers and stories with us. And we'll go ahead and let you off the hook.